Welcome to another edition of African Americans Ain't African, the talk show that proves without a shadow of a doubt that the so-called African American didn't find his way to America in the trunk of a ship. I'm your host, the Indigenous One, and tonight we have a special guest, and we're going to do it like a continuation from where we were last week. Tonight, Chief Fire River is going to join us, and he's going to talk about the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico, and find out the quagmire what the Puerto Ricans are down there. He's also going to share some documents with us and get us out of this. We got to be clear on what's coming up, y'all. And this brother's going to help sort things out. So, Chief Fire River, welcome to African Americans Ain't Africans.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Like you said, my name is Fire River Amaguatu. My colonial name is Taino Palermo, Dr. Taino Palermo. I'm a professor and program director of 2-degree programs at a university here in Providence. Originally from New York City, and for most of my life, always thought of myself, and still do in some regards, but in a different way, as a Puerto Rican. That's all I've ever known myself to be. I know of my country, Puerto Rico, and identified with Tainos, the indigenous people of Puerto Rico, what we know today as Puerto Rico, just as my first name. My parents had nothing more beyond the superficial knowledge of our indigeneity, and had enough wherewithal to preserve that by naming me Taino, and my two sisters Taino names. My middle sister is Guanina. Guania is the region of Borinquen where we descendants of, which we know today as Ponce, Puerto Rico, in the southern part of the island. And my older sister, whose middle name is Saray being one of the cacique's daughters, we would call a royal descendant, a princess, if you will, of the chief. So that's who I am. And in my understanding of my identity, it kind of really shifted when I read a book called The War Against All Puerto Ricans. This book is written by Nelson Dennis. Nelson Dennis is the former editor-in-chief and owner of the largest Latino publication in New York City, El Diario. He's an investigative journalist by trade, and he wrote this book after getting access to thousands and thousands of declassified FBI and CIA documents that clearly articulated the oppression and suppression of the Puerto Rican independence movement, primarily by the leading political movement at the time, the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party. And so understanding and reading this book, reading these documents, understanding my own personal immediate family's timeline of when they left Puerto Rico to come to New York City, where we settled and established roots, was around the time in the 50s that aligned with the timeline in this book that kind of blew my mind, because around this time was the heightened resistance to occupation of the island by the U.S. government. And in a nutshell, this book essentially chronologically outlines the policies that have suppressed the people of Puerto Rico. So we can go on and on about that. What isn't necessarily clearly intended from the book, but the unintended outcome of understanding that book in the context of federal policy and the way the U.S. government treats Puerto Rico, and has treated Puerto Rico, and actually views Puerto Rico in terms of governance, or the ability to be independent, is deeper than and goes back further than what we know in terms of recent developments, especially with the economic crisis, the population loss, the hurricane, than our treatment towards Puerto Rico most recently. This is actually a tap compared to the blows we have received in the history of our nation and the strip mining of our indigeneity as aborigines to that land. And so when you think about the Puerto Rican and the common breakdown of the Puerto Rican mix, if you will, is the Taino Indian, which anecdotally was always thought to be extinct. The African slave, imported from West Africa, primarily Ghana and mostly just West African nations, but primarily from Ghana, and the Spanish conquistador, so the European. And so as Puerto Rico, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Hispaniola, as it was known then, Jamaica, parts of southern Florida before it became colonized by the British, was all Spanish, and Spanish was colonized by Spain. And prior to the colonization, that was all Taino territory, right? It was a really nice exhibit at the American Indian Museum, the Smithsonian in New York City right now, highlighting the artifacts and history of the Taino people, and demystifying and debunking the myth that we don't exist, right? So this book really set a course in motion while I was also aligning and understanding the laws and regulations and policies and protections and entitlements that are bestowed upon me, and I and all indigenous people to these lands are entitled to by way of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP, ADRIP, the American Declaration Rights of Indigenous People. These nation-to-nation binding documents that clearly articulate the rights of indigenous people. And so I slowly began to realize how I have been fraudulently imposed this identity that is a part of me. I have always been a Puerto Rican from New York who enjoys the Puerto Rican Day Parade, and I've always enjoyed that and honor that part of my life. But I also understand the fact that I have been misled and and have been misinformed of my not only true identity but also the entitlements of what is bestowed upon me as an indigenous person who has been conformed and wrapped around a nation state that has formed around them. Okay. And this nation state happens to be one of the most powerful in the world. And so the uniqueness between Puerto Ricans as opposed to other Latino populations is the fact that we are still a colony. We are not an independent country. We were granted sovereignty during the Paris Treaty Agreement, which was the end of the Spanish-American War. And this was the principle of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party. The day the treaty was signed and Spain relinquished its occupation of Puerto Rico, the next day the U.S. showed up on the shores and occupied the island. And so never once was there an agreement, is there a treaty in place, nor was there ever any terms of relinquishing the colony that granted it to the U.S. So, it's not even a colonizer to colonizer type of agreement. So this is a true colony, okay? In 1899, this was a true colony that was invaded with less than 24 hours of sovereignty. They were invaded, and that is where this book, The War Against All Puerto Ricans, begins, okay? So as I'm understanding all of this and backwards mapping my entire history, I start doing my family tree. I start understanding laws, and I have a doctorate already at this point, but I'm not a lawyer. So I'm trying to understand all of the elements around international law, all of the elements that protect indigenous people, not federally classified Native Americans, okay? What people have to understand about federally classified Native Americans is that they are a subcategory of citizens to this country, right? So I'm a Puerto Rican. I checked the box, Puerto Rican on a census, but Puerto Rico isn't an identity. It's not a nationality. I just told you it's a mix of three sourced nations, right? Africa, Europe, and indigenous people to that land, right? So I have traced my family roots back to pre-US occupation. The documented history of my family tree goes back to my fifth great grandmother. A simple ancestry.com tree triggered everything. And I found my fifth great grandmother, who is Salome Negron y Torres. Okay. And so she is born in Ponce in 1772. Okay. So I can, at a minimum, I can trace my roots back to this island, back to this uh, uh, fifth generation back pre the occupation of the U.S. So right off the bat, I have the documentation that proves I am indigenous to this land pre the occupation of the U.S. As do most Puerto Ricans, because believe it or not, at this time, although I have documentation of the birth of my fifth great grandmother, it is because in Puerto Rico, birth certificates are signed by the grandmother and it includes the grandmother's date of birth. So ancestry.com pulls all that information as just data points and spits it out. And so the documentation is there, right? And so prior to US occupation and the US Census in Puerto Rico, the Spanish kept their own census. Okay. And so this is documented in their historical documentation. And so they kept records of free Indians and enslaved Indians. They had periods where Spaniards were allowed to marry Europeans as a way to like elevate yourself in social status. So there's well documented, scholarly accepted documentation of the relationship and enslavement, and the oppression and subjugation of the Taínos through Spanish occupation and U.S. occupation. So I start doing my research, right? And you can go to census.gov. I'm going to share a document right now from this 1899 census. Okay. And so you can go to census.gov and look at the very first census, of Puerto Rico. And this is a section from the census. Can you all see this?
Yeah, we can see it. We can see it, Chief.
Okay, so this is a section from the census that refers to, you see this first sentence, having completed the subjugation of the Indians, Ponce de Leon proceeded to enslave them under the Spanish system. So this is the US establishing a baseline census of what is going on in Puerto Rico the day, in the year or so after they have retain control of the island. Okay. And so they are in this statement documenting the fact that there has been observations of Aborigine type people. The frequency of the Aborigine type was very noticeable, and they're referring to the mountains because as the Spanish began killing and enslaving and raping, and actually they were cannibals as well. So they actually ate Taínos. And so while this is all happening, they're documenting the fact that there are still Aborigines left in this island who fled to the mountains. And while they're laying down commercial railroad tracks, which I'll get to in a minute, is where they notice deep into the mountains the prevalence of Aborigine-looking people, right? And so if you go to the mountain area today in Jayuya and Utuado in the middle of the island, it is Taíno territory. There are more Taíno symbols than Puerto Rican flags. Okay, so they are very aware of their indigeneity, right, in the island. So let me also show you in this same 1890 census, excuse me, there is a an actual enumeration of indigenous people. 1 second. Share. And what I'm getting at here is the fact that there is actual documentation from the U.S. federal government of the existence of Tainos. Okay, there's only one Aborigine population to Puerto Rico, and what you see here is an actual census table of the count of how many white and colored. Okay, they're no longer Indians, they're no longer Aborigines, they're no longer black or any. They're just colored, and you have free colored and slave colored, and then you just have white. Okay, and so these are the early 1900s. Okay, so we get to the 20s, the 30s, and this is when the like reject political big dog like offspring, you know, the guy whose son is terrorizing the company, but the guy is the CEO, so you gotta deal with it. That kind of relationship existed with who was in charge of Puerto Rico early on in the early 1900s. So they would put a general, they would put the pain in the ass son or politician who they wanted to placate and give some job to and make them feel special, and they would send them to Puerto Rico. Okay, and so it was a straight reckless governance until the rise of the Puerto Rican National Party. Now, Pedro Albizu Campos was a child during the exchange of handoff from Spain to the U.S. Pedro Albizu Campos, who is referred to as Don Pedro, the liberator or the attempted liberator of Puerto Rico, led the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party. He was the first the first Puerto Rican to graduate from Harvard Law School, and the federal government knew how dangerous he was with his nationalist beliefs, and a Harvard law degree. And so they actually tried to offer him jobs in the Supreme Court here in the US, and he denied them and went back to Puerto Rico to lead the Nationalist Party. But where Albizu Campos failed was not to his own fault. It just wasn't abundantly clear that these systems were all in place. Was trying to rise from within the colonizers' world to get up to the colonizer's ear and tell the colonizer, we are independent, this is who we are. And the angle we are getting at today, and kind of the purpose of this conversation and this discussion, is that through the work of FANA, the Federation of Aboriginal Nations of America, which is a nation of tribal nations, we have essentially just utilized the laws and regulations and treaties that exist, that grant the ability to form structures and sovereign nation states to interact with the federal government, nation to nation. Okay, so we're not asking for a seat at the table. We're sitting down at the table next to them saying, hey, this is what we like to eat. This is what we should be eating. This is how you serve us. And this is also how we engage with one another. Okay, so before you sound off and it sounds too crazy to believe, let me just put things in perspective. Okay, the Dakota Access Pipeline is a good example. There was a lot of national support around the indigenous people there, the protection of that land. But what people don't realize, and there was very few, but there were some articles around why isn't the UN involved, right? What you have to understand is that those natives are federally classified. So they signed away the ability to, they signed off on the ability to grant the federal government to tell them who they are and tell them where they can live. Okay, and so such action results in entitlements and benefits as well, right? And so it's not to judge them for, or any tribe for being federally recognized or not. It's just the point is that they are federally recognized and therefore seen as and classified as their own American citizens who are violating the laws that they agreed to. They agreed to be allowed on that land that is their own land, but they allowed the federal government to tell them that they could live there. And therefore the federal government can tell them where they can't live. Okay. And so let me draw another parallel for you. The killing of Black men in America by law enforcement. Okay. Statistically, it's happening at an alarming rate. Okay. Historically, if you worked in civil rights, you know this has always been a thing. But given the modern day of video and social media, it becomes more apparent. We have more stronger, raw statistics on it, and it is an alarming disparity, right? But it's not a UN humanitarian crisis. Why? Because Blacks are citizens in this country. They are killed by law enforcement who are then exonerated by the justice system. By all accounts, from an outsider's perspective, that's not a humanitarian crisis. That's not the same as the Syrian president chemically gassing his own citizens, right? They didn't sign off on that. They didn't sign a disclaimer that says maybe Assad will gas us as citizens, and we're cool with that. That's a humanitarian crisis, okay? But at the same rate, Black men are dying in Chicago, if not faster, than they're dying in Afghanistan. Okay, that's an actual statistic. So we have a humanitarian crisis in one place, and we don't have one in another. And why is that? And that is because of the structure and classification of those individuals within that nation. And how that happens, for a variety of reasons, for Blacks thinking that they're Black from Africa and not understanding that Indians were also Black, for even lighter skinned Native people who still identify as white and they're blonde haired, blue eyes, but they are indigenous. So there's a whole, ripple effect from a historical generational, policy structure of just racial superiority and racial oppression. So another example, I think that is probably the clearest, is two census from Puerto Rico of my grandfather and his grandmother. My grandfather is a Black Puerto Rican, and my grandmother is fair skinned, very, very light skinned. And so my grandfather was abandoned by his mother and therefore raised by his grandmother. And so his mother is his grandmother, who he was raised by, is a fair skinned woman. And so in the 1929 census, I believe this one is what you'll see here is the house. This is the household. Okay, these names. The head of the household, the husband, was this guy, Eduardo Torres, right? And the wife was this woman, Alejandra Martinez de Torres. Now, my grandfather is Ernesto, okay? Who's the third one from the bottom, Ernesto. If you go to the right, you see the column that says COL. That's colored, okay? The B's that are above it and below it are for blanco, white, okay? So his grandmother is Isabel Palermo, and here she is listed as Blanca, okay? Now, in the immediate census after that, so that was the 29, and the next one was 35. In this census, you see right here is Isabel Palermo, and if you scroll over, right here you see MU. MU stands for mulatto, which was another classification. It was between blanco, white, and colored, Black. So just from one documentation to another, my grandmother, my great-great-grandmother has changed races. Okay, so in the same way you can change your race from census to census, you can, as you can imagine, what is referred to as paper genocide, just essentially not document or not acknowledge the existence of an entire population or their true classification. And so, fast forward to where we are today, has been the reclassification of myself and my entire indigenous bloodline in my family, who have formed the Batamaya Guanea tribe. Within the structure, understanding that there is a Taino Indian nation that we are working to build in an independent structure. And so let me just pause here and just throw out the concept of scalability. Okay, I am one Puerto Rican who happens to have a couple degrees that allow me to have a seat at tables that we normally wouldn't be at. So I understand how economic structures work, how government structures work. I oversee, I chair 2-degree programs, and I oversee faculty and curriculum and students in those programs. Those programs are community development and healthy communities. So I understand the ecosystems of how cities, communities, and policies and all those things are set up. So I'm now getting educated on all of these elements that I had absolutely no concept of. So if it took me this if it took me this long to follow this, to find this bunny rabbit hole and then go down it and discover all of this, imagine how much we or just don't know as a people. And then imagine scalability. If all of Puerto Rico understood their indigeneity and the rights that were afforded to them, how that would look in terms of mobilizing for independence, right? And so this is where Albizu Campos and the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party were not equipped with this understanding, with this breakdown, with this foresight to see that there was a way not to fight from within the system, but to bring to surface your own system, your own structures that establish your independence and your sovereignty and your indigeneity, and engage with a nation, engage with the federal government nation to nation, and not citizen to colonize.
Well, brother, that was a lot. I hope everybody can get and understand that. One of the things that I want to know, and one of the things that I've noticed here, up here in North America, is a lot of people here when you talk about the Caribbean, and I'm not saying everything, and I'm not saying everybody, especially on the East Coast, it's more common. But when you get into the Midwest and on the West Coast, when you talk about the Caribbean, the people seem or act like it's so far away. Now, I first heard about the Taino when I went down to an island called Anguilla. I mean, it's an island that's not really heard of down there by St. Martin, but
Right.
they had the history, the petroglyphs, and all of that, the Taino down there, and it was off the hook. Could you give us an idea of how the people in the Caribbean, and I know they had, and the Caribbean is part of the Americas. Could you give us an idea how the people in the Caribbean, they related to the people up here in the Northern Hemisphere?
Well, it's an interesting question. Like I said, all throughout Puerto Rico, I mean, even Puerto Ricans who have in the diaspora, who have migrated away from the island, synonymous with the Puerto Rican flag are Taino symbols, all everywhere, from the frog to the semi-god, which is the sun with the circles around it, the circle with the circles around it that look like a sun. Those symbols are everywhere in Puerto Rican culture. And also I wouldn't say to the abundance of Puerto Rican culture, but certainly very much so within the Dominican culture. And you can go to Dominican Republic and see Taino symbols throughout the country. But where you start to see just glimpses, or like, oh wow, I didn't realize that, are those smaller Caribbean countries, Anguilla, Aruba, all these smaller spread out islands, that Dominica, that are all indigenous to Tainos, right? And so where you start to lose some of that indigeneity are places like Southern Florida. I was in the Native American Museum in DC earlier in the summer, and they showed there's a map in that museum of the entire Western Hemisphere, and you see, which is essentially just the Americas, and you see all the indigenous people populations into the Americas in this map. And in Southern Florida, all you see are Seminoles, and Tainos had a very large presence in Southern Florida. And so you lose our footprint there. You lose our footprint in places like Jamaica. Jamaica is Jamaica. That's a Taino word. But there's a transition from when Africans were migrated through the Caribbean through the slave trade, that the indigeneity evolved into Maroons, who have now established an indigeneity presence in Jamaica, and the Maroon people. So in the Caribbean, there's more so a mixture of identities, or like a duality. I'm a Dominican, an independent nation of Dominican or Cuban or Puerto Rican, but I know to a degree I have Taino in me, whatever that means in some abstract way. How they relate, and so I answer your question that way because before they can even relate their indigeneity to mainland, the continental U.S. natives, they have to first understand their own indigeneity, and that understanding varies throughout the Caribbean. Like I said, from Jamaica to where they more believe in their indigeneity lies around the Maroon people, and they understand Taino, but don't necessarily identify holistically as their indigenous peoples being Tainos. Whereas Dominicans do, and Puerto Ricans most certainly do. And then to your point, you go into these smaller islands and get surprised at elements that they actually not that they just know that they're indigenous, but that it's Tainos that they actually identify with. And so before they can even relate to the struggles of their indigenous brothers and sisters in the mainland, they have to first understand the validity of their own identities, which varies. And so because it varies, you have this disconnect of just people not understanding their indigeneity, and then you have people in statesides who don't understand their indigeneity. Two Hawks and I get into this conversation and debate all the time with people who identify or throw out these global terms of like Black, or I'm Spanish, so and it's like that. What does that even mean? And no one's ever critically asked somebody that question, and to the point that they had to think about that and actually critically answer it. So we don't even think about those constructs. So to answer your question, it's not to give you a non-answer answer, but it's understanding, like, you can't necessarily recognize something if you've never seen it to begin with. And so Puerto Ricans who are worried about, how they're going to recover from Hurricane Maria aren't in their Taino identity relating to the Dakota Access Pipeline fight. You know what I'm saying? And so that breakdown is also the point of, I think, what we're here for, is to not only educate, but also empower, and then also convert that into action.
You're listening to African Americans Ain't African on YouTube. Please support us. Please support the Facebook page. Come in. We have all kind of documents all kind of information. And it's like the brother was saying earlier, all you have to do is check your family, follow the bloodline in your family. Forget all the stories you heard, forget all the history that they done tried to stuff down your throat. Follow your bloodline. Your mother had you. Her mother had her. Follow the mothers. Follow your father's mother. Follow these women, and they connect right to the soil here in America. A good story to watch. And some people on some of these islands keep their histories intact. A good movie to watch is a movie called Moana. It's a cold piece. And if you look at the movie Moana, and if you listen to the story of Nanawea down in Mississippi, that creation story, it'll blow you away. So we definitely, it could, because to me it looks grim, because we are cut up, we're divided in so many different ideologies. And that's what I want to ask you next, sir. Is that ideology breakdown? Is it, because here we have Christians, Muslims, Hebrew Israelites, Moors, all kind of breakdowns. Do you find that breakdown down in Puerto Rico also?
No, I mean, I think it's not a breakdown to that degree. I think, like I said, Puerto Ricans are very settled and confident and definitive in their Puerto Rican identity, and actually understanding the mix of what constitutes a Puerto Rican, in terms of the Black, European, and indigenous blood. And so the division necessarily doesn't come from ideology in terms of faith. Between the Spanish colonization and the U.S. colonization, I mean, you have the variety of forms of Christianity, but it's all Christianity nonetheless. But there was no so faith wise, ideology wise, as it relates to faith, is a smooth handoff, because it's a Christian based nation. In fact, the manifesto of Pedro Albizu Campos is called Free Puerto Rico. It's his pamphlet that he published prior to being incarcerated and dying in federal prison. He refers to what he refers to as a stupid assault has been made on our Christian social order in a brutal effort to dissolve our family structure and destroy the morality of a noble race, imposing via governmental agencies the spread of prostitution under the deceitful banner of birth control. The ridiculous effort to destroy our Hispanic civilization with a system of public education used in the United States to enslave the masses. So Albizu Campos is who is referred to as Don Pedro, the Che Guevara, the Martin Luther King, the Malcolm X, the freeing of our people savior of Puerto Rico, is glorifying the superiority of Spain in a way in this pamphlet that is more so like our Spanish native language, our Christianity native faith system is being hampered on by the U.S. colonizer. So from that perspective, Puerto Rican nationalists fighting for independence were still anchored in their connection to the European Spaniards and Christianity. And so even in the from the leader of the fight for independence, there is not a recognition of indigeneity, of Taino blood. Not that there wasn't a broader belief system from Albizu Campos or the Nationalist Party. It's just it's not clearly indicated in his landmark manifesto, which I think says something, right? And so ideologies among Puerto Ricans in particular, I can't speak around Dominicans. I'm not on the ground to know culturally how Dominicans, Jamaicans think and move. But I know enough as it relates to their connection and identifying with Taino and indigeneity in that regard, But as it relates to Puerto Rico, there really isn't a varying ideology among in the way that you described with Christianity and Islam and Moors and even modern day religions like Scientology and these kind of things that are just not necessarily rooted in fact or documents or accepted scholarly opinion. It's just belief systems, and you can believe anything you want. You're free to do that, but some things are true and some things aren't. And so in that regard, there isn't a varying belief in ideology. What is a varying belief is what Puerto Ricans believe should be the status of Puerto Rico. Now, you have what I would refer to as colonial-minded Puerto Ricans who believe that we should be a state because we are better off under the structures of the U.S. federal government than being independent. Now, part of that earlier book that I had mentioned, The War Against All Puerto Ricans, there are several declassified federal documents, but also just New York Times excerpts, okay, from the propaganda of that time, describing Puerto Ricans as mongrels, as savages, as people who can't govern themselves. The same narrative they gave to justifying enslaving Africans. Okay, so that's a standard play out of the colonizer playbook. But that oppression becomes, that narrative becomes the belief system and the reality of people who have generationally grown up in that, right? And or is also the accepted belief of most elites and upper class Puerto Ricans who are affluent as you would expect, right? And so ideology wise, the variance I feel is more so around our status as an independent country versus being a state, which I think is a state of stagnation that allows us to continuously be mistreated by the colonizer, who can colonize us and abuse us and then say, hey, we don't own you guys. You're free to be free if you want. So don't come to us for all this help because we don't really own you, but we own you. So I guess that's kind of how I would answer that question.
Well, so would that be the reason why? I don't know if it's, or how's it going in Puerto Rico, because I know very little about Puerto Rico, but I know there's a lot of talk I always hear about Puerto Rico should become the 51st state. Is that the reason why there's opposition to it?
No, the reason I think is opposition to it, the opposition is because we know that the opposition to becoming a 51st state is more so around the fact that we can govern ourselves. We didn't ever not have the ability to govern ourselves. And so there's always remained an opposition to statehood that is in essence an opposition to colonization. Okay, so that's where the resistance to becoming a state comes from. The resistance to becoming a state from the US's side is that they'll have to assume our debt. And so they created our debt. So in order to assume our debt means they have to, either absolve it or pay it down or sell it off or figure out what to do with it. And so no one wants unnecessary debt on their books, and that's how we are perceived. And so that's the carrot they dangle over Puerto Rico, like, hey, if you become a state, all your woes will go away. Maybe they will, but what's left of our identity will certainly go away, right? I mean, you can ask Hawaii, who's tried it, and been successful at maintaining their indigeneity to a degree, but ask Native Hawaiians about what it means to become a state and what that does to their culture and their sovereignty and their ability to preserve their customs and their indigeneity. And so So that's, you have opposition from both sides. That's why it's a very tricky dance. And so the angle we're coming at necessarily from a indigenous perspective is that we understand who we are. We're not, you can't not tell us who we are. You can't dispute who we are. We have documentation proving who we are. You have documentation proving we exist, which I just showed you. And so because of all of that, we are formed under internationally accepted tribal trust nation structure. So we are engaging with you nation to nation. I'm not asking you as a federally classified, or can you please federally classify me? But see, that's a concept Puerto Ricans aren't even thinking about yet. So that is, it wouldn't be it would undermine larger efforts to introduce that dynamic now without understanding, without, being cognizant of the larger political landscape of what it means to become a state versus independence.
How does that United Nations charter, I forget the name of it, but it's a charter where people can, basically govern themselves. How does that charter help the indigenous people of this side of the world?
So it's the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of
Yes.
Indigenous Peoples. It's called UNDRIP, and there is an America's version that is that was issued and signed in 2016. I'm sure no one's heard of it. We have, but it's called ADRIP, the America's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And so both of these are similar documents. The Organization of American States is the America's version of the UN, similar in concept. And so theirs is even more binding than the United Nations because it's speaking directly to the indigenous rights of American Indians. So I'm pulling up the document actually now, just so I can show, I can share it, and everyone can get an idea of what this looks like. So this document is essentially the bedrock of the rights bestowed to indigenous peoples, right? And so, of course, being signed by the United Nations, the U.S. being a member nation. This document is a universally agreed upon declaration, and right off of Article 1, you see indigenous people have the right to full enjoyment as a collective or as individuals under this charter, and they have the right to be free from any kind of discrimination in the exercise of those rights. Okay, and so these articles go on to outline the rights to indigenous people who are native to their lands and are subject to a nation state forming around them. And so because a nation state has formed around them, that nation state is beholden to those indigenous people that they have formed this nation around. And those indigenous people are afforded these rights, are obligated, entitled to these rights. This is a non-disputable. I'm not making these up. This is the UN, right? So these are the structures we are operating under. As you can think of it as non-federally classified, but it's bigger than that. You would be categorizing us as like, some other type of U.S. citizen. We engage with the federal government nation to nation. Okay, and so this is a very abstract concept to understand, which is a whole nother session of just going through the documents that actually speak to the structures that afford the rights bestowed to us as indigenous people. And to prevent the Rachel Dolezals of the world, and any Tom, Dick, and Harry saying, "Oh, I'm an Indian, I should get free this, and that." There is intentional structures around this. The articles aren't just willy-nilly allowing and just loosely worded. Okay, this is very intentional language. Indigenous people, indigenous Americans are are surely afforded their ability to self-identify. But as you try to flex legal and federal rights and laws, things become a little more clearer of the fact that, like, an Indian in the eyes of the federal government is one who is associated with a tribe and can prove such. Okay, and that is a very minimal requirement to be identified as an Indian in the federal government. Now, you don't need the federal government to identify you as that, but if you want them to, that's how you do it. And so we're not, going in this willy-nilly approach. This is all a very formal, structured situation. And to get Puerto Ricans on board with this and understanding this element, this is an educational campaign before it's an actual reclassification and policy campaign.
You know, they just had a big fire down in Brazil, and it burned up a whole bunch of the artifacts down there. What do you think about that? And how does that affect the people on this side of the world?
Well, it depends on, Two Hawks. Are you still on the line?
Indeed, I am.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, it depends on the structures of their native communities and the historical archives of their elders. So, in an international court, an international stage, in one of the articles, you'll see there are oral history is as valid as documented history. Okay. Such is the case with accepted scholarly opinion. So there may not be artifacts per se for the sake of validating their existence, but if there are elders and an accepted opinion of the existence in previous treaties or relationships or symbols or artifacts or things like that, there is still an opportunity to salvage it through oral documentation. Correct, Two Hawks?
Absolutely, because if you think about it, their written books are pretty much just their oral traditions written down somewhere.
Right.
So we have to view ours as just as valid, especially if it's tradition that's been passed down for generations upon generations, something that we just know to be true.
And so, to another way to answer that question is the Taínos. I mean, if it were not for the work that we are doing, the work of cultural and international practitioners and leaders and advocates around the Taíno community, Chief Robert Marrero is a perfect example. These folks are preserving Taíno history while there are academic institutions and colonizing authors who are saying the Taínos are dead. They're an extinct race. But when I did my DNA, 15% of my blood is Native American. Who am I native to? If all of my family and my documented history is in one part of this Americas, what native am I? I thought the Taínos were extinct. And so the point is that as with 15% Native American blood, and the fact that I have documented family lineage of my ancestral connection to my indigenous land of Borinquen, that percentage of my blood is superior, is the remaining superiority of the diluted blood that has been infused into my indigenous bloodline. The African blood, the European blood that has diluted and in an attempt to genocide to extinguish the race. And so oral history alone has kept Taínos alive. Yes, please do.
That's a point that I really want to hit home. I'm glad you said that. This colonial system has duped us into this mindset that as soon as we have any sort of admixture, up there goes the Indian. I'm less of an Indian now. No, you're just an Indian with some other bloodlines in you. But I refuse to accept or even entertain the notion that if I am in the same lands that my people have been in for generations, thousands of years, that regardless of what other bloodlines my bloods might mix with, I'm somehow not an Indian anymore. If I am in my lands and we've been here, then it doesn't matter what I'm mixing with, I'm an Indian. And as long as I'm here in my Indian lands, that's how I'm going to be expected to be viewed, and that's how I think everyone should be expected to be viewed. My people would say if you got even one drop of Narragansett blood, you're a Narragansett because of exactly what we're talking here today, the whole goal of doing away with us so that they could just take our lands and do what they want with them. I'm done with my ramble, so I'll turn the mic back over to you.
No, just, I mean, to your point, I mean, the flip side of that is the Racial Integrity Act, the one drop rule. So if one drop if one drop, which is just an observational one drop, you don't look European, so you must have at least one drop of some colored blood in you, you are colored. And so it works the other way around, does it not?
Absolutely, sir. Absolutely.
Of course. So, what do you think, since you live here in America, what do you think that the people here in America, because and I know you see the confusion, you're up there by New York. What do you think are some of the things, or because one of the things that people are always asking, and and I just humor them because I really don't believe that they're really serious about it. But one of the things that we always hear about, well, what are the solutions? What are some of the things that you can tell the people wherever they come from? Because I'm down here in the deep South, and man, they have had a mind fuck pulled over on them. What are some of the things that you can let the people know that can help them along their journey?
I mean, I think the very simple thing, and you touched on it earlier. I mean, I think the very simple thing is just do some personal research and find out who you are. It sounds very simple, but I guarantee you, there isn't one person who doesn't have a ancestral breadcrumb trail to follow. There isn't, and see where that ends up, and then tell me how you view yourself. Then rethink about your identity, who you are. Um, especially for people of color in the U.S., people who may appear or think or certainly have some base knowledge that they are, not necessarily indigenous to Europe. They are not European descendants, so they come from some other nation. They know at least that much. If that is where you are, follow your ancestral breadcrumb trail and see where that leads you. I guarantee you will find what I found. You will find documentation of a hard left in your bloodline that you didn't even know you had. You'll find documentation of kings, of queens, of chiefs, of leaders, of advocates, of people who you had no idea. Test your DNA, find out where your roots come from. That alone is profound. It humbles you. It makes you realize you are part of a larger ecosystem. You are part of a larger design. Okay, and so when you understand that element, you understand you're not. I'm not Taino from New York, who was grew up in New York City and went to college, and I'm more than that. I am Amaguatu. I am Fire River. I am of descendants of chiefs, of leaders, of fighters, of warriors, of my family in Ponce lived on the same block as Don Pedro Albizu Campos. I did not know that. I went to Puerto Rico in March after having all of this information and literally documented the entire like inhabitants of my ancestors, my grandfather, my grandmother, where they all lived. I went to those areas and re-saw them in a whole new light. I became totally connected to my place, to my island, to my home in a way I never had identified with that island and my people before, to the point where I'm now moving this work in this direction. And so if there's one thing you take away from this is go try it needs one simple thing. Go back to your fifth great grandparent on either side, however far back you can go. If you can go back to your fifth great grandparent, I guarantee you your personal narrative will completely change. And then consider your indigeneity, whatever that may be.
I have to agree with you on that, man. I've done that, and you're absolutely right. Before we get out of here, I have a question that a brother asked, and I want to pass that question on to you. D. Davis asked, brother, why doesn't the United States let dark woolly-haired Ricans in America, or do they just like staying home?
Why? Say that again. Why do they what?
He said, why doesn't the United States let the darker skinned Puerto Ricans in America, or do they just like staying home?
Well, I don't know. I don't know how much. I don't know what he means by not letting them in America. Like I said, my grandfather, who was on the census as colored, different than his own grandmother. My grandfather was a black Puerto Rican, as I said. My grandmother was a fair-skinned Puerto Rican. Their families hated each other. Ask Cubans about white Cubans and black Cubans. Go to, watch Univision or Telemundo and watch those anchors and those reporters from South American countries who all look like European models. But the indigenous people in those South American countries all look like indigenous Indians, right? So there's always been a black-white divide and racial superiority in all countries. In fact, America is actually the baby at it. It's been happening in European countries and in South American countries, Central American, Caribbean countries, this racial superiority. So I don't know about black Puerto Ricans, blacker, darker skinned Puerto Ricans not being allowed into the U.S., but I would certainly say that there is a division between Latino, Caribbean Latino blacks and light and whites from their own countries. Now, that again, that's I don't think that's unique to Puerto Rico. But when you're saying are they just staying home, I'm not necessarily sure what he's referring to there. But I think there's also, like I mentioned, if I'm following correctly, I mean, there's also a large population of dark Puerto Ricans who identify as Taínos in the mountains. And so I'm not necessarily sure if that answered his question or if he's referring to some other type of thing, because the other element to his question is that, Puerto Rico right now is going to lose 20% of its population by 2020. They lose a medical doctor a day. They are over $1 billion in debt in Medicaid reimbursements alone. So healthcare is a very fragile structure, and people are migrating. In fact, to the point where the Southern District of Florida, which is represented by Marco Rubio, who's a staunch conservative and is a white Cuban who is part of a conservative population in Southern Florida, the white Cubans who praised when Fidel Castro died, who, by the way, was an ally and fought and advocated for the independence of Puerto Rico with Albizu Campos, and was partially the reason why Fidel and Cuba were ostracized by the US, as well as their communist values, but because of their support for Puerto Rico. So those white Cubans in Southern Florida are now being outnumbered by Puerto Ricans, which is also why Senator Rubio is the chair of the Promesa board, which is the financial oversight board for Puerto Rico. Okay, so you got to understand there's these connections between the migration patterns and the citizenship of Puerto Ricans who have no representation on the island, but can freely move to the States and elect and vote. Okay, so so I'm not sure if that necessarily answers this question, but there's migration happening out of the island for white, black, and everything in between. People are just trying to get the hell out of Puerto Rico. And there's also just the racial divide, as there are in every country, between a racial superiority of white and black.
I don't think it's that. I think a lot of times it's the language that confuses us, because a lot of us think black means one thing, a lot of us think native one thing, and one of the things that I do, I don't use the term dark because I know what it means, but I know what's being said when the person's saying it. So one of the things I think that we do to ourselves, we don't move on. We don't take something, learn from it, give it to, and move on. We just stay stuck in these certain ideologies mentally, psychologically. We stay stuck in these ideologies, and we refuse to grow. So, that's why I wanted to ask, but you answered it quite well, because the people in the Caribbean, and this is the whole thing about the slave trade, that when I say we don't think at all, the Caribbean is on the same longitude lines as Africa. The sun, it's close to the equator. So the people down there, they get hit by the sun damn near 365 days a year. I mean, that should, I mean, damn. It's
Well,
that simple.
it's not you. We don't have to do the work, right? So we can
Right,
point people to this. Okay, so
right.
there's a book. Like I said, I oversee 2 degree programs. I'm a professor at Roger Williams University in Providence, Rhode Island. This past year, we had New York Times best-selling author Ibram X. Kendi, whose book came out earlier this year called "Stamped from the Beginning." Okay, it's called "The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America." It's called "Stamped from the Beginning," and what you just referred to is something that established the early structures around racial superiority as it relates to laws. Okay, and there's two main theories that established that were the cornerstone of thought between white and black, and white being superior to black. Okay, one of those things were the climate change theory, was that people were darker skinned and black because they were by proximity geographically closer to the sun. So if they moved if they moved further away from the sun, their skin would lighten to its true color, white being the epicenter of race. Okay, this is an early concept in the early 1400s. Okay, and as we get into the time of Shakespeare, these racial superiority racial superior ideas become codified in pop culture at that time through things like Shakespeare. Okay, so Shakespearean plays, poetry, song, okay, has superiority over white European. White European was essentially the epicenter of racial superiority. Okay, and so that was the cornerstone of racial policy, and just this international understanding of race. What debunked that theory was when European voyagers went to northern Canada and found First Nation Aborigine people in Canada who were dark skinned. The Eskimos, they're not near the sun, so how are they dark skinned? So that threw off the whole climate change theory. And so then they had to just say that they were genetically inferior. They weren't as smart. They weren't able to conceive concepts and deep thoughts, and they were brutes. They were workhorses. Ironically, they were bodies to be abused, but also didn't need to rest because they were workhorses, and that's just who they were. So you don't need to believe me. This is text. This is documentation. This is all in a place you can find on your own and do your own research. Now, if you don't want to believe, a scholarly opinion, or I'm not telling you to believe Ibram Zendi. I'm telling you that Ibram Zendi has a compilation of all the documentation you need to validate why you think you are who you are, or why you believe you are who you are when you in fact aren't, or you believe a narrative about you or your people that is not true.
Cool, brother. Well, is there anything you want to leave with the audience before we shut it down?
No, that's it. Just know who you are. That's all, and don't say anything with confirmation without facts. That's all. That's all I'm saying.
Right. And I want to say this before we close out, and I say this every week. It's simple, guys. Women have babies. No man feet touches the ground unless he comes through his mother. This is not anti-male or nothing, because I'm a male itself, but we got to look at the reality of what's going on. The females have the babies. So simply follow your mama's mama, and you'll get closer to the point. Also, follow your father's mother, and you'll get closer to who you're supposed to be. With that, I want to tell everybody good night, and we'll see you next time. Peace out.